Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Raisha Bivens, and I am a Stop Solitary Connecticut board member. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I've been involved on the committee for a little over a year to really end solitary confinement in Connecticut and actually create a system, a system that's rehabilitative in Connecticut versus punitive. So today I'm joined by my committee members, Kevnisha Boyd and Bob Gillis, and I'm going to have them introduce themselves in a minute. But today we're going to be talking about the Stanford Prison Experiment, which is a very famous experiment that delved into the behavior of correctional officers. And the research question was, the abusive behavior and oppressive behavior of correctional officers, is that something that is prompted by the environment or something that's more motivated by people's personalities? So we'll get more into this and how it relates to the Protect Act and our work, but I'm going to turn the mic over to Kevnisha Boyd, because this was her wonderful idea to have a conversation live about this. And so Kevnisha, why don't you just introduce yourself and your work?
Thank you, Aisha, for the lovely introduction. So yes, as she said, my name is Kevnisha Boyd, and I am also a board member of the Stop Solitary Confinement Committee. I've been on the committee now officially for about maybe like 4 months, but I have always supported the Stop Solitary Confinement movement since about December of 2019, which I think was the launch of the official campaign. Yeah, so I saw Bob there, which was quite comforting and familiar. So I'll give a little history about that, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about me. So I graduated with my bachelor's degree in psychology and criminal justice, and I really had struggled looking for a job. And so my first job within a correctional setting was actually at the Roger Sherman House, which is a New Haven transitional halfway house for men that are on parole. And Bob was my boss. He was the director. He was my boss. And he hired me, and I worked there for about 6 years. And Bob had left maybe about like halfway into there. So that is my connection to Bob, and really what helped me, to feel comfortable with joining a committee, because Bob was familiar. So outside of that, I am a licensed mental health therapist and owner of Quality Counseling, which is a group practice in Hamden, Connecticut. And my former work experience is a mental health counselor for Department of Corrections. I worked for New Haven Correctional for about 4 years, and I resigned in July or August of 2019. And it was a really hard decision that I had to make. But I started to lose myself in terms of my identity. I started to lose my sanity. I started to lose my dignity. And I really started to have some compassion fatigue, and just my objective of being there shifted. I no longer was there healing people, which was my true intention. I really just started to conform and not care, essentially, and become really lax within my clinical practices due to some of the constraints that we'll definitely talk about later. And yeah, that is me, and I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to share some information about the Stanford Prison Experiment. So I'll pass the floor over to Bob.
Okay, well, I think you know my name. I'm Robert Gillis. I live in New Haven. I worked for the State Department of Correction for 36 years in various capacities. Started in 1970, and curiously enough, the time period when I started working coincides directly with the Stanford Prison Experiment. And I really got quite a charge looking at the appearance of these guys, because it's so of 1970. It really took me back a few steps. I started off as a caseworker at New Haven Correctional Center, and then I went to work in the Department of Correction funded halfway house as a work release counselor, and continued in various case management functions up until the point that I transferred down to Bridgeport as deputy warden for treatment services. Was there for about 11 years, and then I was appointed to my first wardenship at the Eddy DWI facility. It was the first and last DWI facility in Connecticut. It phased out because of budgetary considerations. It was also one of those pet crimes in the 80s that actually the punishments seem to have reduced the behavior. It's one of the few experiences in my career where I've actually seen that the punitive aspects of the law did in fact change behavior. I think there was far less drunk driving as a result of the prison experiences that people were subjected to as a result of the laws that were passed at that point. I then transferred as warden to New Haven Correctional Center, and it was a very difficult time. The gangs were on the increase at that point, and the population levels were increasing. Population at Whaley Avenue was high density, high velocity, a lot of people there and a lot of movement because it was a direct admit facility. After a couple of years, I transferred to the Gates Correctional Institution in Niantic, which is the male institution connected with what is now York, although it was an independent facility. I really enjoyed the place. It was a minimum security, open environment. I was given a lot of freedom to experiment with some treatment options. And after a while, 11 or 12 years, I joined the parole division as director of parole and community services, and was responsible for overseeing halfway house operations, the activities of the parole officers in the street, so forth. And sooner or later, I decided it was time to retire. Then I went to work at Roger Sherman House as program director, and Kevnisha has told you what that is. That is a halfway house located on House Street in New Haven, which specializes in community reintegration. And then I finally decided I'd had it with criminal justice, retired fully about 2012, and then kind of was recruited into Stop Solitary by a friend. And I think that was back in 2018, maybe early 2019. And I've been doing stuff with the group ever since then. Now, as far as the Stanford experiment is concerned, I've got a lot to say about that, and it's not all about solitary confinement, but we'll get into that as time goes on.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, for the generous introduction and sharing all of your experiences. I didn't even know all of the different places that you've worked in the Department of Correction. So we're gonna get into it. I had, I practiced social work for 12 years. I don't do that full time anymore, but I am very passionate about this advocacy work. And what I didn't say in the beginning is I got involved and started having an express commitment to really transform the justice system after my younger brother, Joshua, who has schizophrenia, was incarcerated 3 years ago and languished in pretrial detention for 3 years. Now, through my advocacy, he's no longer incarcerated and his legal case is complete and he's released to the community. But seeing as a family member and advocate of someone incarcerated that there was so much missing in the system in terms of care and treatment made me really devote myself to this cause. Having said all that, I never learned about this study in school. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Kevnisha because, like I said, it was her idea to really have a public dialogue about this. And why don't you tell us, Kevnisha, how did you actually come to learn about this Stanford prison experiment? Why do you think it's important in the context of our work, at Stop Solitary for people in the public to just really know about this?
Yes, thank you. So I learned about the Stanford Prison Experiment in my social psychology class in undergraduate school. And it is a very controversial and very popular experiment that is often quite cited in reference in regards to institutions that have power. So some of the big major concepts that the study looks at is dehumanization, which is really when you take a group of people and you deny them of their human rights by a series of things that we will definitely look into. Then another part that the experiment looks at is another clinical concept, which is de-individualization, which reference more to staff that work for institutions that have power and control over people. And the study does a really good job of reflecting the psychological impact of the prison environment, right? Not looking at the individualistic personality traits and characteristic of the person, right? But really looking at the institution and the policies and the practices and the rules and the structures of some of these systems. So I'll get into it. So in 1971, Dr. Zimbardo and two other colleagues decided to create a simulated prison experiment. So they created a prison in the basement of a psychology building at the Stanford University. And so they had 24 college male participants. They put an ad out in the newspaper and randomly got a selection of people. And there was 24 participants. And basically by the flip of a coin, people were put into two categories, either prisoner or guard. And so for the training that the guards received was really direct training in terms of being aggressive, being strict, being cold. Dr. Zimbardo even gave instructions for them to wear their uniforms a certain way, to wear glasses, to not necessarily make eye contact. Again, really not starting because the dehumanization part started before they set foot there, but emphasizing, right, that you're not a human. Right, so I'm not going to treat you as such. I'm not going to make eye contact with you, and I'm going to be very cold, which just emphasizes, the lack of human rights and human dignity that all people really deserve. So they go into the categories, and the experiment is intended for, I believe, 2 weeks. The experiment is terminated after 6 days. 6 days. So what ended up happening was Zimbardo himself even reflects back and acknowledges that he started to not behave as a psychologist running an experiment, but he started to behave as a warden running a prison. And so he admits as to getting really encompassed in the power and the control that he had. And the guards really took on an abusive role. They started to deny the prisoners bathroom privileges, food. They started to lie. They were placing the prisoners in what they had simulated in terms of an isolated confinement space. So what ultimately led to the termination of the experiment was within 36 hours, one of the prisoners experienced a mental breakdown. They started to decompensate, become very anxious. And the movie does a really good job of the visual representation of what that looks like. And so they even had like a priest, somebody that played like a priest come around, and even the priest started to really take on this role and really like blur the reality of it being an experiment, right? Which again, emphasize the prisoners of really taking on this submissive, obedient role, which is very, very common in terms of the real actual prison environment. And so even within the experiment, family and friends got to come to visit some of the participants, and even they started to become very enthralled into the role of the prisoner and the guard, where people started to almost forget that it was an experiment and that it was going to end. So yes, it was terminated. And let me see, what else can I say? Yeah, I'll take a break. Any questions or any feedback?
Yeah. Yeah, when you just recreated, so there's a movie on Amazon for those of you who aren't familiar with the experiment but want to learn more. And it does an amazing job of vividly depicting what actually happened in the study. And Kevnisha, I have to tell you, like every 15 minutes in the movie, I was like, I can't believe this. I was appalled with the way that the correction officers were treating the prisoners in a mock study. And I was also appalled with the fact that it was even a study in the first place, because you'll see when you watch the movie that there's one point where there's a prisoner who leads a revolt, in a sense, right? Like he tries to step out of his submissive role. They were being denied certain things, and he tries to like bring the other prisoners together so that they can be treated with respect and dignity. And after being put in the hole, which you see in the background, which is restrictive housing, solitary confinement, he starts to decompensate. Like, it's very clear, like he can't take it. And I think what disturbed me the most in that scene is when he went to the head of the experiment and his team of people, and he was saying that he didn't feel well. And someone who was, I guess, previously incarcerated was like, he's lying. This is what he's making it up. And to me, like that is just so indicative of what happens when people are incarcerated. It's almost like their voice at some point isn't valid, and they start to be heard a certain way, even when they have legitimate things going on. So yeah, anything in particular, having actually worked in corrections as a mental health worker, that you want to reflect on in terms of that specific point? Yeah.
Yes, so much. So one thing I'll say is that the Stanford Prison Experiment is definitely controversial because of how unethical it actually is. However, the experiment being unethical definitely doesn't dilute some of the realness in terms of what actually does happen in the environment. And I think, but the experiment does a good job of giving us an idea of what best practices really should happen. So what I like what you said about, when they thought that the guy inside the hole was lying. So from a professional experience, so my clinical education comes from a forensic psychology background. So my clinical training is specific in forensic populations, and forensic is a fancy word for people involved in the legal system. So in school, there is a clinical concept called malingering. And that is when somebody is believed to be exaggerating or creating superficial symptoms of a mental health condition. So what I find is that, in reference of comparing my clinical training versus somebody who didn't have specific forensic psychology clinical training, is that there's not an emphasis of malingering in the opposite training. But here, right, being that I was identified as somebody that wanted to work with the forensic population, that's a very instilled concept that we're taught early on, is to always assess if somebody is malingering, right? So I have to reflect back and ask myself, well, what type of bias did that create for my own clinical interactions within the prison environment, right? That I'm already being taught before I even step foot in that this group of people has a very good chance of lying.
Wow.
But the conversation is not had about, well, they're lying because they're being deprived which means when there's an opportunity to get something, they want a lot of it, right?
Yep.
So it's a somewhat of needing to lie to survive.
Mm.
So yeah, if I'm meeting, so if I'm an incarcerated person and I'm meeting with a mental health counselor who stereotypically is warm and giving, naturally I do probably want to feed in to see if I can get something, right? Because something in a prison environment is better than nothing, because you get nothing. And
Yeah.
so, you know, I think it's just really important. And what I like that the study does is it takes away the individual perspective. And so the analogy that they use is apples and a barrel, right? So I guess it's like a one bad apple makes the whole barrel go bad, you know, but the analogy that they say is, but nobody talks about the barrel and whether the barrel has vinegar at the bottom, right? And how the barrel is really making the apples rotten. Not apples aren't, you know, I don't know, they're not grown rotten, right? Just like people aren't born evil. So, you know, it definitely creates some context. So I would love to hear from Bob.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I think this was a perfect point to chime in. Having led, you know, a bunch of different facilities and Department of Corrections and managed staff, would love for you to jump in and just share your thoughts about this.
There are a number of things obviously really impressed me about this experiment. It was funded by the Office of Naval Research, federal government. And the scope of the study was to explore the effects of role playing. And we really did discover what those effects were. I mean, I was impressed by a whole lot of stuff. And one thing I would lead off with, the behavior of the guards. Now, bear in mind, when the selection process was kicked off, all of the participants were asked what role they wanted to play. Not that it made any difference, because the roles were chosen by a toss of the coin. Most, if not all of them, wanted to be prisoners because they thought it would be less work than being a guard. And also in the historical context, cops and uniformed personnel had responded to student unrest on the campus at Stanford, where this happened. So that had a lot to do with the desires of the participants to be prisoners as opposed to guards. What impressed me about the guards' behavior once this thing kicked off was what I've called the creativity of evil. How did they ever come up with this stuff? I mean, all of these things that they had the prisoners do was just bizarre. And it's the kind of thing which individual people probably would not have come up with on their own. But there's something about the synergy of the group that allows this to happen. And I did read some stuff about the fact that much of the abuse took place on what I call the 12 to 8 shift, the graveyard shift. They thought they weren't being observed and filmed by the graduate students who were in the other side of the wall. Now, I mean, this goes on and on and on, because Zimbardo ended up having a role to play in the analysis of the Abu Ghraib prison situation, and it was very similar. I mean, this tells us more about people than it tells us about prisons. But people who are in prisons are certainly caught up in no uncertain way about this. It sort of teaches you the value of a uniform, the value of labeling, the necessity for people in authority to treat the other people as aliens. They are not people like us. They're people like them, and we aren't them, we are us. It teaches us the one thing that Zimbardo said in one of his comments, it's not what people do, but what they're told to do.
Mm-hmm.
False narrative. Remember, this took place in 6 days. 6 days. This isn't 6 months. It's not a lifetime. It's 6 days of people who were playing roles that they got so involved with that they even thought about contacting attorneys to come in and get them out of prison for a 6-day experiment. I mean, that's really the aspect of it. And of course, the guards were bored. That was another fact. And the boredom is what led them into this series of abusive gestures. Unity in numbers.
So I have a question, right? Because I hear you and Kevnisha on the one hand, and it's not you both personally, right? Where this is actually part of the study that is questioning, is it the environment that actually causes people to behave this way? And on the one hand, we're saying it does, right? There's this nature of the environment and the way that corrections is set up. And even in the study, there's some people who say, right, this study, the results weren't actually very accurate because Zimbardo went and actually told them to do anything they needed to do to keep the order. He actually told them behaviors to take on that would lead to the dehumanization. So I just am wondering, from your like real life experience inside of corrections and managing staff, is this a challenge that you face with your staff, or do you think that the way people are oriented into corrections influences the way that they actually treat people that are incarcerated? Is that ingrained into the culture? And I know I'm putting you on the spot, but I want to.
I think it does. And I think that the role of the training academy is critical at the very outset of letting people know what punishment is, what its limits are, and the fact that Department of Correction personnel are not hired for the purpose of punishment. They are hired to operate and operate correctional facilities and supervise the people who are there because they have been punished by having their freedom restricted and removed for a specified period of time. They have not been sent to the institution for punishment. The punishment is administered by the court, which is a decision made to remove people from free agency in the community. And what happens with staff is that they have to be told what to do. You can't just say, do what seems right to you. They also have to realize that the danger of a false narrative leads us to what we had happen in Washington 2 weeks ago. People believe all that stuff, and I don't think there was any, well, we know that this is still going on. And I would have said 6 months ago, this is hooey. This can't happen. Well, it has happened, and it is the nature of the false narrative and the fact that authority can lead us anywhere.
Yeah, got it.
Yes.
Got it. So what I hear you saying, Bob, is that really it's up to the leadership in corrections in any correctional environment to
Absolutely.
really enforce that. It's not people's job to enforce punishment further than the fact that these folks are already incarcerated. That's punishment enough. And that if leadership is not enforcing that.
And remember, and I've made this comment a couple of times in our steering committee meetings, people who are sent to prison don't start off being combative in not most cases. Overwhelming majority of people come in. Now some have had experiences before, and their reliance on previous experience kicks in because of what they expect to find. Staff tend to get the behavior they expect. And I'll give you an example. When I was at New Haven, there were open dormitories there, and some of the officers wanted to have guards not guards, but like these plexiglass panels put up around the workstation they had. That was basically at the front of the dormitory. It was set up a little bit on the platform, but they wanted to have these screens that were put up in front of them. And the question is, why do you want that? Well, it's so that we can duck when they throw soap at us. I said, if you expect that kind of thing to happen, it'll happen. We're going to send a message out. We're not going to put that up there. Now, I don't know if somebody else put it up after I left, but there are all kinds of subtle signals. And to me, the idea of having, two officers together doing patrols leads to unity in numbers. The staff they begin to feel invincible. Which is why one of the things that I find sort of questionable, and I'm going all over the place, but one of the things that I question about the new new law that was passed about requiring officers to report other officers when things are happening improperly, places a lot of pressure on people to conform to the norms of abuse.
Yeah, got it. We're gonna thank you, Bob. We're gonna come
Am I
back.
answering your question, or am I just
No, you
rambling
answered the
all over?
question. You
So
definitely answered the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Kevnisha, before I have another question, but just anything to add about anything Bob was saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. So another layer that I wanted to add is, I think also society plays a big part in terms of perpetuating this negative image and stigma of people that are incarcerated, right? Like super violent or super predators. So even before people, step into a correctional facility, there's already this preconceived notion that they are bad and they are evil. And so I think what Zimbardo did by, giving the training and the instructions to be aggressive and, to really implement some dehumanizing practices was because he wanted it to reflect essentially. He wanted the guards to have that same, belief that the prisoners were bad people. And, there's no other way that he could have done that other than by saying, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is how you should treat them. Because I don't think for the general public that, correctional staff necessarily look at people that are incarcerated as victims or as people with chronic conditions. If we want to look at antisocial type of behavior, which a lot of people that are incarcerated have those types of personality traits, that always connects back to childhood trauma, right? So just again, us not looking at necessarily the root of things, but just creating these policies and practices and systems that are doing no good for anything. So I think it's a double fold, right? I definitely think leadership plays a part in terms of establishing the culture, right? And when we think of symbols of power, so the uniform, the army boots, the military language, lieutenant, captain, the symbols of power include handcuffs and the chemical agent, right? All of that creates this power shift of us versus them. And having worked there, it is a rare case where you go against your team and your staff. It's not a thing. It is honestly, you'd be ostracized and isolated for doing that, and it's not something that somebody has to say. So I'm not saying when you become an employee there, they take you in this room and say, these are the things you can't do, but it's definitely insinuated through the things that you see. The things that you see and the lack of accountability, to somewhat of what Bob was saying in terms of the increase of abuse on third shift. I think, the institution collectively, there's just a lack of accountability. So if you see other people getting away with abuse, you're likely to do it because you think that you can get away with it too. And sometimes, most of the time, you do get away
Right.
with it. So, yeah.
Right. I got
Yeah, there was
Thank you. And I wanted to go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
there was a
You have something quick?
situation that I'm reminded of. One of my colleagues started off many years ago as a college student working in the facility. And there was an event that took place that he had seen. And he was one of the witnesses and was asked to report what happened. And he did. He described, blow by blow, who did what to whom. And there was some overzealous behavior on the part of the officers. The person who was conducting the investigation looked at him and said, well, whose side are you on anyway? Well, he stuck to his guns, and he remains a good friend of mine. He did tell the truth as he saw it. But
I got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what he heard from someone in leadership doing the investigation.
Yes.
So yeah, in essence, to both of your points, even if you want to do good in the system and you want to do what's right and ethical, there are all these components in the culture that make it difficult and can make it challenging. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, got it. So, we covered some of these other questions, but what I'm going to go to is, what surprised you and disturbed you the most about the study? You could either touch on that question, or you could touch upon, why do you think it's important, especially in the context of our work, for people to actually know about this study?
Well, I will go back to what I said earlier. The creativity of evil. And if we don't have very strict guidelines that are familiar to everybody who works in the institutions, especially in regard to these restrictive housing situations, as you know, the PROTECT Act has a number of steps built into it in terms of governing the placement and continuation of people in restrictive housing. I think that it's important to get this stuff established now because the climate is ready for it. We have to take advantage of the opportunities when they're there. Remember, this is a swinging pendulum. It may go back the other way at some point. Back in 1990, we were in the lock them up and throw the key away viewpoint, and many of our penal code things were put in place at that time. Northern was constructed and opened at that time. Now we're stuck with it. Well, we can do something to get rid of it, and certainly to severely limit some of the practices before the pendulum starts to spring back the other way. And who knows? I mean, this is a very dangerous world we're living in, not because of street crime, but because of the crazies that are out there. That's where I come. We have to, seize the moment and do what we can now.
Got it. So this really stresses the urgency of really altering the culture and transforming the environment.
We could end up being them.
Got it.
Unfortunate circumstances.
Yeah, very, very provocative, Bob, but true, because that was one of the points of the study, that if you and I flipped the coin and we were guards, we would have behaved that way. Now, I like to think differently, but given the context, I could see how it would be difficult if you're in that role, and if you are actually punished in Department of Corrections for trying to do things which might be perceived as ethical and good, how it will be hard to really be the one pushing the bar and holding a level of accountability for people's humanity. So yeah, Kevnisha, were you gonna jump in?
Yes. I think that is a word in terms of we can become them. And if you're me, I'm from the inner city, and both my parents were both incarcerated. So I am them. I am them. I tell people we're all one happy hour, 3 drinks, and a drive home away from being incarcerated. So, to tie it back to the experiment, one of the big conclusions, really is about people have the ability to be good or evil. And it certainly is a switch. And the switch is the social influence, and social influence being conformity, norm formation, values, policies, rules, perceptions of this group of people. So there's a lot of things that go into influence, but I do definitely agree that we all have that ability. So like you, right? Like I've dedicated legitimately my entire professional career, to working with people that have been impacted by the criminal justice system. So I forgot my point. Sorry.
I got it. We with you. All right. It's all good.
I don't know. Okay. So what I'll say, for me, the most disturbing, honestly, is how closely it can be generalized to the real environment. Like, let's just be real. And so that's quite disturbing. And then I'll say the fact that this study was conducted in 1971 and is, widely cited, and we have all of this knowledge and all of this research, but we are not applying it to real law to make real changes. So essentially it's like, okay, so we know this is harmful.
Yep.
Okay. And we're not going to do anything about it. How am I supposed to be okay with that? I can't be. Like, I can't be when people are dying and suffering, and people are going into, incarceration without mental health conditions, and they're leaving with mental health conditions. And it's just like, so as a society, we're okay with this?
Yeah.
I'm not. Like, this is just not okay for us to be doing to a set of vulnerable people. If we even look at the type of people that are incarcerated, it's just like, this is not how you rehabilitate somebody or make a community safer. So it's disturbing that we know it's not healthy, but yet and still there's a lot of opposition. There's a lot of opposition. So what Stop Solitary CT is looking to do is not so radical. We won't be the first state to look for these types of changes. We're quite behind, right? So as our committee has met with, other commissioners of other states, and I've got the privilege to hear about some of the work that they're doing in their institutions, and it makes me so upset, because it's like, so this is an option. Like, we actually have an option to make this institution a safer, more rehabilitative place, not just for the people that are incarcerated, but also for the staff. And I speak from both perspectives. I wanted to retire. I wanted to get my pension and have my student loans forgiven. And that was taken away from me because I could no longer function in working there. So, it's a really unsafe space for everybody.
Yeah, I get it, Kevnisha. And Leighton Johnson, our committee member, has a question in the chat. So I'm going to go to his question in a minute, but I just wanted to ask you, first of all, I totally get your upset having worked there and then, just been traumatized because of what you witnessed and experienced. But what do you think is the resistance to transforming the culture and actually treating people humanely? Why do you think there's so much opposition? Yeah.
I think the resistance is due to, again, the perception of the people that are incarcerated. So, within reviewing the study, I can't cite exactly where, because I read a bunch of stuff. But, he really talks about how institutions with power use safety and security as this safety, not safety, but like a protective guard, right? In terms of being able to rationalize some of the immoral policies. Whereas, you know, in terms of the committee connecting with other states that have been a lot more progressive, they are very clear that when the institution functions to support the incarcerated person and to support the staff, violence decreases, everything, right? There's not even a need for isolated confinement because the facility and the people are just functioning at a much higher level. Their basic needs are being met. So we're not talking about anything fancy, right? Just basic needs. Human contact, resources, education, training, mental health support, medical support, basic needs that any human needs to thrive. And that's allegedly what we want people incarcerated to do, right? Is to come home and thrive, not repeat some of the same cycles and types of behavior that a toxic institution can really reinforce.
Thank you, Kevnisha. And to everyone watching, you know, I think that's what we have to remember, that the majority of people that are incarcerated are actually going to return to the community at some point. And so if they're returning as broken human beings and worse psychologically than when they enter, that's going to have an impact on our communities, on our families, on our society, everything. So it's not just what happens to them stays in the prison. It actually impacts all of us, right? And the more people are psychologically damaged in prison, the more costly their care is in prison, the more costly their care is when they return to the community. So we really want to actually keep that in mind as we're advocating to pass this bill, and as you're in conversations with legislators, that that's a real fact that we have to take care of. And that's why this is a public health issue. So I'm going to go to Leighton's question, and then we're going to come back and connect this to our bill, the PROTECT Act. Leighton said, and I'm going to direct this to you, Bob, how does mass psychology or crowd mentality play a role in the dehumanization of incarcerated people? And I think we touched upon it a lot, right? But anything to add? Yeah.
I will go back to the idea of creating an alien group. It's absolutely amazing when you look at the behavior of U.S. Army personnel during World War II in relationship to those people who were running military prisons for prisoners of war. The Germans were treated far better than the Japanese. And it wasn't simply because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. It's because they had slanty eyes. It was because they were not viewed as being human to the same level that the German prisoners of war were viewed. It's what happened to the Indians, Native Americans, back in the 1870s and 1880s, who had their culture taken away from them if they were lucky enough to survive. So, you know, what does mass behavior have to do? A great deal. Take a good look again at what happened down in Washington. Some of the Capitol Police, some law enforcement personnel, some corrections personnel were all part of this group of insurrectionists. I'm beginning to sound paranoid. I don't want to do that. But when people are viewed as having like interests, they will do almost anything to oppose those who are not like them. For example, shooting the Speaker of the House of Representatives. Now, come on. The false narrative, again, will give you power.
Got it.
Well, if Leighton approves of my answer, but got a lot of stuff there. But I mean, it's not a simple issue. This stuff affects every corner of our lives these days. And I agree with Kevnisha wholeheartedly about the need to set standards, the need to do something to reverse what we can reverse in regard to the institutions that incarcerate people in this state.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Bob. Well done. I'm gonna pull up a slide to talk about the Protect Act as it relates to our conversation today. For some of you who may just maybe you're just learning about the Protect Act today, or you just want us to share the specific components of it. So just give me 1 second to share my screen. And let's see. Okay. And Bob, you made such great points. I don't think we have the space to touch upon everything you said today, but you're also pointing to how institutionalized racism even impacts, the crowd mentality about people, right? When you mentioned the Japanese and how they were treated versus the Germans and Native American people. So that's definitely integrated into the system and impacts how people are treated. Especially with, Black and Latino people being the primary population incarcerated today. So maybe that will be round 2 at another time. Okay. All right. So here's the Protect Act. And, the Protect Act stands for Promoting Responsible Oversight, Treatment, and Effective Correctional Transparency. So the main components of the Protect Act are that it stops extreme isolation, it will end abusive restraints, it will protect social bonds. Our bill will ensure that people actually have a certain amount of visits a week, that they continue to be able to have calls with their family members and their loved ones, no matter what, that they're able to receive mail, and that those privileges aren't taken away. It also promotes correctional wellness, which Kevnisha, talked about the impact of working in an environment where correctional wellness was not fully supported. Our bill would ensure that correction officers have the support that they need with the situations that they face inside. It also was shut down Northern by December of 2020. What year are we in? 2022?
2021.
So 2022, we would be shutting down Northern.
Okay.
By the end. And then it also would reform the way that data collection is done. Right now it's really difficult to find out the true facts and the true status about how many people are in extreme isolation in Connecticut prisons. And while other states have really focused on shutting down what might be known as restrictive housing or punitive segregation, we actually are committed to making sure that everybody in every prison in Connecticut is out of their cell at least 8 hours out the day. So we want to make sure that there's transparency around data collection. So once this bill is implemented, we could actually see where it's working and where we need to keep pushing for reform and transformation. And then lastly, it ensures oversight and accountability. Our bill advocates for an ombudsman, which would really be able to investigate grievances and be an outside person, really ensuring that people incarcerated, that their needs and their concerns are really responded to. And then we would also have a community board that has some members that were formerly incarcerated on that board as well, working, kind of hand in hand with the ombudsman. So with all that said, Kevnisha, I'll have you start with this question. What do you think are the implications of the study when it comes to the Protect Act and, everything that we're advocating for with the passage of the Protect Act?
Yeah, I think that the implications are pretty direct. I really think the Protect Act addresses a lot of the conclusions and generalizations that we can take from the experiment in terms of, creating moral policies and destigmatizing the perception and, again, supporting staff. It really takes a collective approach, right? So while stopping isolated confinement is the heart of the bill, you know, there's these branches of the other, you know, of the bill that definitely does a really good job of supporting one another. Because as we can see from the study, it's not one factor. It's not one thing. It's a collective formation of a lot of things, right? And I do think, you know, the Protect Act can look complex, but real change is complex. And abuse in an institution, you know, has to be changed with a very complex and layered solution. And I think I know the Protect Act addresses a lot of the pitfalls of Department of Corrections, you know, and I don't have a favorite part of it. I love all of it. I love all of it. It attests to the totality of everybody, right? Like humanizing the policies, humanizing the staff, and humanizing the incarcerated people. It's time. It's a new year. We've got a new president. Department of Corrections has a new commissioner. I cannot think of a more appropriate time that we need a law, right? There's a police accountability bill, and corrections often is the forgotten law enforcement profession, right? So I think that just to mirror complete criminal justice reform, the Protect Act does a great job of bringing light to institutional change. So, yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevnisha. Bob, anything to add? How the study relates?
And I will try to be brief.
Okay.
The Department of Correction is supposed to be correcting the behavior of those people committed to them. This bill is about correcting corrections. And that's what's important. We are trying to change the environment by making a number of specific changes. Why, after 50 years of Department of Correction in Connecticut, do we have to correct the agency which is supposed to correct other people? It's because it needs it. And this is the way it's accomplished, by this and probably all kinds of other stuff too. But
yeah, thank you, Bob. Really, really succinct and really powerful. Because if we just go back to the study for a second, right, and we go back to the example you gave, Kevnisha, of the barrel and the rotten apples in the barrel. The barrel needs to be corrected, and if the barrel's trying to correct itself, it's just human nature not to be able to do that. And I'm not letting anybody off the hook, but I think the bottom line, that's what we're saying, is that from a psychological and a social psychology perspectives, that is what happens to human beings. And so we want to have corrections be accountable in a way that would really not only support the people working inside, but the people that are incarcerated inside. And that just leads to a happier, healthier community for all of us, because correction officers work in our community. And like I said earlier, the people incarcerated, most of them will be actually released.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
That was beautifully said. I appreciate you saying that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Kevnisha. I'm going to go to one more slide so that you know different ways that you can continue to support our work. And let's just see what this one is here. Okay, so all right, so here are some ways that you can continue to support our advocacy. For those of you watching, join us every 2 weeks. We have an organizing call on usually Saturdays, but our next call is Friday, February 5th at 6 p.m. I'll be sending out the link via our email database on our website at stopsolitaryct.org. You'll find our advocacy toolkit. And that's just basically a very simple way. If you want to reach out to your legislators, the Judiciary Committee, it's a very simple template that would allow you to do that within less than 5 minutes. And the more that our legislators, and particularly the Judiciary Committee, hears from you and hears from their constituents, the more they're going to know the urgency of passing this bill in this legislative session. Lastly, Kevnisha also leads our support group every other week as well. and always sends out reminders for that through the email database. So feel free also to register for that and be supported if you're formerly incarcerated yourself or you have loved ones incarcerated. We want to keep providing that safe space for you. Anything you wanted to add, Kevnisha?
No, that was good. Yes, the support group is, our next support group is Monday at 6. And I encourage anybody that is formerly incarcerated or family or friends that have been affected or impacted by incarceration to come by, get a word, get some support. It's a safe space. It's not therapy, but it is a safe space where we do give some therapeutic resources. So register at our website.
Awesome. Thank you, Kevnisha. All right. Lastly, we are actually hosting a virtual press release this coming Monday, which is on National Freedom Day at 9 a.m. You can register for our press conference at stopsolitaryct.org. We are going to be joined by Colleen Lord and another family member that has a loved one incarcerated at Northern. There are going to be different legislators who actually support our bill. And you're just going to keep hearing more points about why it's urgent that we really pass the PROTECT Act. So again, you can register by going right online to stopsolitaryct.org. So any final reflections and final points? I really want to thank you, Kevnisha, for bringing this idea and all the work you put into this. She did these beautiful slides, y'all.
Thank you.
Make sure this was succinct for all of you. Thank you, Bob, but I want to give you space. Any final summarizing points you want to make? I have one, but I'll let you guys go first.
I'll just, I just appreciate everybody's time and commitment, especially, our committee members and the people that support us in the community. I am excited about the PROTECT Act. I believe in the PROTECT Act, and I am very confident that our bill will be passed this year. So I'm just, I'm just happy that I get to share my story and really be able to have some sort of influence for major change that really needs to happen.
Thank you, Kevnisha. Awesome. Bob, any final thoughts for you?
Yeah, one final thing. I think that the Department of Corrections' job is to prepare people for release. And they can't do that when they've got all this other stuff going on in the institutions that creates the environment of total negativity. And let's put that behind us. Let's get this bill passed so we can move on to doing something far more productive to society at large.
Yeah, great call to action. And the final thing that I'll say, definitely shout out to every single one of our committee members, everybody watching. Thank you for being with us and sharing space, holding space with us for this transformation in the justice system. And I want to just go back to one thing Kevnisha said earlier in the interview, which is that this was a mock study. The mock prisoners went into prison, and after a couple days, they were dehumanized, right? And so the narrative you often hear is, well, what if people are violent? What are you going to do then? I urge each of you listening that to really kind of look at that narrative, that oftentimes people aren't going in being violent, but it's the barrel. It's the environment that's creating this context of us versus them, and for those type of things to actually occur. So that's what I wanted to leave everybody with to reflect on. Join us on our press conference Monday. Keep following us. We love you. And we're going to pass the PROTECT Act this year. Thank you.
Thank you.